we are rapidly approaching a day of great fear. And I don't mean Halloween. I don't directly mean Election Day or the day after. I mean the day before Halloween. So how many of you have a name for the night before Halloween? Okay, my fellow Michigander does, which I expected. Because in Michigan, in Detroit, we call it Devil's Night. And it's been in my mind lately as I have been noticing the fear that's in my mind for some reason. And I've been reflecting on how I might work with this when how have I been afraid in the past? And in my life, perhaps the time I have experienced the most fear was when I was about 8 years old. My mom was taking night classes in accounting at the local community college, and one night her class fell on Devil's Night. And I remember where I was standing in the house, sobbing because my mom had to go out on Devil's Night, and I was convinced she was going to be killed. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about Devil's Night, I'll have to tell you a little bit of a backstory. But really, the focus is, of course, on how does one work with this fear? So I've been thinking about, okay, when I was 8, I didn't have that many tools to work with my mind. I didn't have a lot of information, but now I have more. So if I think about working with that 8-year-old, what would I first advise her to do? Well, first, take refuge. And, and of course, refuge doesn't mean just sitting there saying, Buddha, 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 Buddha. And I really think about this one quote from Venerable Thubten teachings on the essence of refined gold from 2007 that, for me, really captures what it means to take refuge. You have that remembrance of your teacher, the teachings, and the Dharma that you've heard. And that's what taking refuge in the 3 jewels means at that moment. You aren't praying to the Buddha to change the external circumstance, but you're praying to the 3 jewels to inspire your mind so that you remember what Dharma medicine to take at that particular moment. So perhaps 8-year-old me could have prayed to Tara to protect my mother, but more importantly, I could have asked, well, what Dharma medicine can I apply to my mind? So fear is not necessarily a section of the Lamrim, how to work with fear, but when we talk about it here, we often talk about it in terms of attachment, that fear is arising from, I might lose something that I'm attached to. I'm not convinced it would be very skillful to talk to an 8-year-old about how they shouldn't be attached to their mother. I'm not convinced that that would be very helpful. And so I'm going to leave that to the side. But obviously working on attachment is one thing that's really helpful with working with fear, and whatever fear I'm experiencing right now, I have found it helpful to think about what am I attached to in this situation that I think I'm going to lose. So then when I review, okay, what are the Dharma teachings that I've heard? What else might I bring forward? I think about the guided meditations on the stages of the path. Venerable Thubten's guided meditations that we, of course, practice here and the safe participants practice. And the first one comes to mind. Mind is the source of happiness and pain. And one of the points that we reflect on in that meditation is whether the way we described the situation was realistic and how we were describing the situation then impacted how we experienced it. So when I think back about how 8-year-old me was experiencing Devil's Night, it was basically like the 2013 horror movie, The Purge, which I'm guessing none of you have seen, but okay, good. But basically the plot of this horror movie is that in a dystopic version of the US, there's one night a year where all of the laws are just temporarily waived, the police won't respond, and everyone just goes out and murders each other. And so that was my view of Devil's Night. That's not actually what it was. It wasn't, I can't even now, online, looking at data, find any indication that there was an increase of assault or murder that night. It was more of a big arson party. In 1983, as Devil's Night really started to gain more momentum in its new form, There were 600 fires in the city of Detroit from October 29th to 31. And in 1984, 6 weeks before I was born, there were 810 fires over that 3-day period. 300 of them alone occurred on Devil's Night, October 30th. And it wasn't just the number of fires, but the image that came out of it, the national coverage of Detroit. Fire buffs started to travel from all over the country to Detroit to see these fires. Off-duty firefighters from other places in Michigan would go. And so the pyromaniacs and attention-seeking youth would have these huge audiences for the buildings they were burning down. So that's what it actually was. So was I seeing the situation realistically? That when I lived on the very edge of the suburbs, and my mother was going to the community college still in the suburbs, that somehow a bunch of fires in downtown Detroit was of danger to her or me? No. So I was not seeing the situation realistically. But if at that point I just put it down and walked away and said, okay, good, everything's fine, that would really also demonstrate a certain level of self-centeredness. To say, oh good, I'm not in danger, my mother isn't in danger. So again, now through that Dharma medicine lens, I can say, oh wow, okay, let's keep looking at the situation, but see how much of my fear in that moment was really just about self-centeredness, just about me and mine. So a second meditation that comes to mind is the second meditation in the book on transforming attachment. And that question of, in this meditation, what is the worst thing that could happen, and is that likely? So if I now use a bit of a bigger framework to think about what it was like for the people of Detroit then, not just me and the suburbs, they were dealing with a lot of fires. And while it was mostly abandoned buildings being lit on fire, as the Associated Press reported in 1984, sometimes those fires spread to occupied houses. So at this point, I can think about compassion, bringing compassion up in my mind, saying rather than being fearful about this terrible thing that's happening, I can see that, wow, there's a lot of suffering happening. Suffering of the people who are engaging in this activity, possibly creating great negative karma. Suffering of the people who are living in that area and are possibly afraid of their homes burning down. And so thinking in this way, ideally compassion isn't just, oh, poor them, but actually moving us to act. And I find it helpful whenever I'm upset to think of Shantideva. And the quote that came to mind here is verse 10 from chapter 6. If there is a remedy when trouble strikes, what reason is there for despondency? And if there is no help for it, what use is there being sad? And we could, instead of sad, say angry, or in this case, fearful. So what might the remedy be for something like this? Now, of course, 8-year-old me couldn't necessarily do much at that point, but others could. And in 1985, after the worst night of this in 1984, the Devil's Night Task Force was started by the mayor of Detroit, and they saw that it was really only in certain parts of the city that these fires were occurring. And so in that year, the mayor mobilized a group of 8,000 people, including city employees and just volunteers, to go out and be on the streets to try to help keep this a little more tame. And that helped a little bit, and in 1986, the mayor then implemented a curfew from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for all minors, which was enforced, though people didn't take it seriously that first year. And they also asked the local newspapers or television crews to not show footage of the fire until 11 p.m. so that people wouldn't be reminded, hey, it's a good time to go out and light some fires today, to really change that bigger social view of what was happening. And this made a difference. By 1988, 1989, there were only 100 fires that night in Detroit, so that was considered a success. Because there were 20 to 30,000 volunteers out in the city helping patrol and make sure that people's houses didn't burn down. A few years later, from 91 to 93, there were only 60 to 70 fires on Devil's Night, and there were over 30,000 volunteers. Great. New mayor came in, Dennis Archer, who said, we're doing so well, this isn't a priority anymore. He had very few volunteers, and there were 200 fires. So after that, the following year in 95, he called it the Angels' Night campaign to really have this new attitude towards Devil's Night. There were over 25,000 volunteers, and again, the fires went down. By 2001, there were again over 30,000 volunteers, which for context is twice the population that we have here in Pend Oreille County, right? And not only were there volunteers out in the street, they really recognized that there were many causes and conditions that were leading to this happening. It wasn't just some bad people. The police department went out and removed over 2,000 abandoned vehicles, frequent targets of arson, and the Department of Public Works demolished over 700 abandoned buildings in 2001, again, helping really decrease the number of fires. The following year in 2002, again a new mayor, there were almost 50,000 volunteers out, and there were only 37 fires that night. And these aren't necessarily all arson. And for comparison, the average number of daily fires in the city of Detroit around that time per day was 60 to 65. So having those 46,000 volunteers out actually made that night better than normal. So this continued for some time, and it stayed well controlled. And by 2017, by this time I was already visiting the Abbey, Angels' Night was retired. It was replaced with a big community celebration on October 30th. And the fire chief said then, from now on, Halloween in Detroit isn't going to be about fear. It's going to be about fun. And a few years later, the current mayor said, we had a generation of kids who grew up thinking Halloween is the time when all the vehicles flashing yellow lights were on streets to make sure their house didn't burn. Now we're going into our 4th year without that. We're going to have another generation of kids who will never remember anything else about Halloween except for trick-or-treating. And so for me, it's really this beautiful comparison that remembering when I thought that Devil's Night was this utterly terrifying thing, kind of, that you're going to get murdered if you leave your house on it. And to know now they're just kids trick-or-treating in Detroit. And what's beautiful is on this, the flag of the city of Detroit, there's 2 Latin phrases, and one of them is Speramus Meliora, we hope for better things. And that's really this beautiful image that's capturing what the community was able to do in response to this terrible, fearsome thing. So reflecting on this has really helped me think about how I'm going to keep working with my own fear that I have right now. And first is, of course, taking refuge, meaning remembering the teachings, thinking about what I know about the Dharma, and turning to what's going to help, rather than just basking in the fear. Part of that is, of course, asking, is attachment involved? How can I work with that attachment? And whether or not I'm seeing the situation realistically. And that is something I've found that has been very helpful. Then, even if, okay, there is some real danger in the situation, asking what can I do? And making sure that I'm doing that out of compassion, which has wisdom in it, rather than out of anger, which does not have wisdom in it. And regardless of whether I can do anything or not, recognizing that the situation is impermanent. It will change and easily can improve, especially if many people come together. And while I love Speramus Meliora, I think there's one way that I would change it within the Buddhist context. Don't just hope for better things, create the causes for better things, right? If we just sit at home and pray, that isn't necessarily going to change anything in the world. But we can act out of compassion and wisdom. And we can also recognize within the Buddhist framework that this isn't just about making the world right here and now better, but recognizing that we can have a better situation by being liberated from this world of dukkha altogether. And that instead of just helping others be free from the fear that their houses are going to be burned down, actually help them be free from all fears of samsara, which we can only do if we become Buddhas ourselves. So hopefully whatever situation that I am going to encounter in the coming weeks, months, years, or the rest of my life, I hope that I can transform that fear into not only hope, but really trying to create the causes to both improve the world here and now, but also cultivate my own renunciation and bodhicitta.